just like the river I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
57% of the women surveyed reported that they had needed to offer sexual favors in exchange for jobs, medical care, and even when seeking placements at school for their children. 57%. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Robert Scott, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. This stomach-churning 57% refers to a 2019 survey conducted in Zimbabwe. Is this an isolated incident? I will let you be the judge. In 2019, a Norwegian ex-cabinet minister was sentenced to 5 years for abusing his position as regional governor to sexually exploit 3 young men seeking asylum in the country between 2011 and 2017. In Israel, the Bar Association chief had to step down in 2019 after a legal intern who had failed the bar exam accused him of offering to help her pass it in exchange for sex. The police subsequently arrested him for having sex with another woman in exchange for appointing her as a judge at a magistrate's court. As of early 2019, authorities were also investigating whether he had sex with the wife of another judge in return for promoting the judge to the district court. Disgusting. In 2017, the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had to open a case against one of its own employees, a female regional supervisor, who was accused by various subordinates of demanding sex for benefits at work. Those who refused her advances suffered reprisals such as increased workload and being tasked with complex cases to investigate. In the Central African Republic, a report by the Pulitzer Center found that sextortion, as what is termed, is so widespread in education that school children have a nickname for such a predatory practice. It's called sexually transmitted grades. Taking it closer to home, a 1999 survey right here in Jamaica spoke to the prevalence of sexual harassment at the workplace. Of the persons surveyed, 33% have been subjected to sexual harassment. Only 13% attempted to make a report. And of those 13% that made a report, absolutely nothing came of it. Now, all this is shocking, but not surprising, as our own Paula Llewellyn, Director of Public Prosecutions, echoes the views of some of the populace when she says, it's just a little sex, no big deal. You see, in the Jamaican setting, it begins with seemingly innocent comments. There is something about you that I like, but I can't put my finger on it. Or, if I told you you had a great body, would you hold it against me? To more ominous comments such as, you need to know where your bread is buttered. And this leads to outright victimization. But just a little sex mentality is a big deal, as it leaves indelible scars and has even drove victims to suicide. So those of you here today, we thank you for showing up to make a difference in your workplace and indeed the society. I will not delay the proceedings any further, save and except to introduce our president, Mr. John Mahfood, a gentleman who needs no introduction, but I'll do so anyway. His formative years were spent at the Woolman's Boys School, but despite this initial setback, he's persevered and was subsequently qualified as a chartered accountant. No stranger to business, he held executive leadership positions at Grace Kennedy. And King John, as I call him, runs an empire known as Jamaica Teas that is involved in manufacturing, real estate, and other ventures. He's a mentor to many and an example to all, as he gives of his time and knowledge and expertise to manufacturers and young entrepreneurs. Yes, Sir John, they talk about you behind your back and the great things that you've done for them. So please, join me in welcoming King John to bring greetings.
Thank you, Robert. That was very sweet of you. And I appreciate the comments you made in the beginning about this subject. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining the meeting to discuss a very important topic, sexual harassment within the workplace. This topic may make some people uncomfortable. It is certainly not easy to talk about, especially if you're a victim. In light of the widespread issues we face and recent legislations passed to address it, the JMEA sees the need to increase awareness among our staff members and the industry and show our support with the goal to reduce incidents and stamping out the culture from the population. As an employer, we have a responsibility to maintain a workplace that is free of sexual harassment. This is our legal obligation. If we, as employers, allow sexual harassment to flourish in our workplace, we will pay a high price, which is poor employee morale, low productivity, and possibly lawsuits. We in Jamaica have not been exposed much to the issue in terms of training and awareness. We see it on our televisions. We see it a lot in first world countries being reported. We see it when high profile persons are brought to bear, and that's our biggest, I think, exposure to it is when big businessmen or actors and actresses are accused of it, or sports people. I sometimes wonder, why it is not something we really think about much in Jamaica as it relates to us. I think maybe one of the reasons is that we think of it more in terms of issues that happen in the ghettos and where you have strong predators who can take advantage of young ladies. But in our workplace, I think it's an issue of we are relatively small companies, and we don't have a lot of formal policies internally. We don't have strong HR departments that set policies regarding human interaction, human behavior, and so on. And so, you have obviously large international companies. You have big Jamaican companies who have formal policies. But generally speaking, most of our members, our 450 or so members, are small companies. And they're run by one individual, very informal. And I think that is part of the issue. So most of us, including myself, are not too aware of the issue as it relates to the Jamaican workplace. And I think that the more we can learn about it, the more sensitive we can be, it's all the better for us. And obviously, when you think about it as a father or a mother, you would never want your child to be subject of this. And so from that standpoint, I think is how we need to look at this situation. On the practical side, preventing sexual harassment will provide benefits to the workplace. Having a culture that acknowledges that discrimination and sexual harassments are wrong, and that can have a harmful effect on the workplace environment, ensuring that employees feel safe at work and are treated with dignity and respect, upholding company values and adhering to systems of ethics and personal morals, and complying with the Sexual Harassment Act. So, ladies and gentlemen, we as the JMEA feel it's an important area to bring awareness, and we will be a much better group if we are more sensitive to this matter and ensure that it does not happen in our environment. So thank you very much, and I look forward to learning more about this matter. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for those very important words. We'll now get to the meat of the matter, but for a few housekeeping matters. I invite you to keep your microphones muted, except when acknowledged and you're allowed to speak or invited to speak. If you wish to speak, please use the raised hand function. Of course, please keep your questions short and to the point. If you feel you have a burning question that you will forget, please put it in the chat. The presenter may see it and address it, or we'll certainly call it when we have the question and answer. The restrooms are to the, well, I believe you can figure that out. Now there's a bonus prize. For those who remain with us to the end of the session, there's a prize that we will give at the end of the workshop. No, it's not an Amazon gift card, but it's some useful information I think you may be interested in. I will now invite our first presenter. Our first presenter is none other than someone with a wealth of experience that has looked the demon straight into his or her eyes and has lived to tell the tale. Counseling and guiding victims. Jahmealla Romance is a trained social worker who is employed to the Community Liaison Unit in the Bureau of Gender Affairs in the Ministry of Culture, Gender, Entertainment, and Sports. Given her unique perspective, she has been conducting sexual harassment workshops for the past 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome her warmly. You feel free to unmute, acknowledge, and then go back on mute, and then she will begin. So please, let us welcome our first presenter, none other than Miss Jahmealla Romance.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I hope everyone's morning is going good so far. All right, so today my presentation will be understanding sexual harassment in the workplace, and I'll go a little about the legislation. Right, I'll speak a little about that, as I'll share my presentation and then I'll get right into it. One moment, please. Let me share. Okay, let's get right into it. But a little before I go in the presentation, let's talk about the Bureau of Gender Affairs. I'm from the Bureau of Gender Affairs. We're located at 529 South Oden Avenue. That's right in the middle of Halfway Tree, right across from the Transport Center. We were the first national machinery to be established in the Caribbean. That was in 1972. But back then we were known as the Bureau of Women's Affairs. However, in 2016, there was a cabinet decision for a name change from the Bureau of Women's Affairs to the Bureau of Gender Affairs. But what is the Bureau of Gender Affairs? What are we about? We engage in programs and initiatives which seeks to empower Jamaicans and to mainstream gender across Jamaica to achieve gender equality and social justice. So this is one such training that we have that encourages gender equality and social justice. So sexual harassment is a type of gender-based violence. What is gender-based violence? It is any act directed at someone because of their sex and gender that results in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering. So, into the meat of the matter, what is sexual harassment? We often hear about it. Some persons may experience it. Some persons experience it and don't know that they're experiencing sexual harassment. So let's get into the definition. Sexual harassment consists of unwelcome and unwanted physical, verbal, or nonverbal sexual conduct which are offensive or humiliating to the person. So any form of sexual advances that are being made to you, once it makes you uncomfortable, once it is unwanted, it is deemed as sexual harassment. Now, the rejection of which or submission to such conduct is used explicitly or implicitly to influence a decision which affects the person. Right, so it affects your job. once you reject it, even if you accept such favor, it still affects your job, right? Because whatever you wanted, you will be getting. Hence, it affects you. So the conduct usually involves the abuse of power by someone in the position of authority and influence, right? Always. There may be chance, there may be 1 or 2 cases where it's not a supervisor, it's not a manager, it's not a director, it's not the CEO, right? But majority of the cases, it is always someone in authority and influence. So there are 2 types of sexual harassment. One, quid pro quo. It means this for that, right? It also means sexual blackmail. So you have to do something in order to get something. Individuals are pressured to grant sexual favors by a person in authority in return for promotion, job prospect, favorable performance evaluation, etc. So you have to be granting some form of sexual favors in order to get, most times, a promotion, most times to get a work, to ensure that you are secured, your job is secured. Another type is the poison hostile work environment, and it is created when unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or other verbal or nonverbal conduct or physical conduct of a sexual nature creates an intimidating, hostile, abusive, offensive, or poison environment which interferes with an individual performance. So oftentimes what we see is when these persons in authority ask for these sexual favors and you decline those sexual favors, it affects your job negatively, right? They may report you to HR to say, okay, I don't think this person is no longer qualified. So they ensure that you lose your job, right? Another example of a toxic or a poison environment is you may dress well as a female, you dress very well, and you go to work every day, and a male keep giving you compliments and say, you bright up, you bright up the workplace, man. I like this dress, it suits you well, right? And every day they keep giving you, and every day you say, please stop. Refrain from giving me such compliment. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. It is unwanted. Yet still the person continues to do so. That is an example of a poison work environment. As simple as it may be, a compliment. Some persons don't like compliments, right? There was a case where some farm workers went to Canada and the Canadians are complaining that they are sexually harassing them. So when we did our investigation, we realized it was just mere compliments. Good morning, I like your smile, you bright up our morning. And they took that very, very offensive, right? And said the Jamaicans are sexually harassing them. So it wasn't a physical type, but the verbal, what we say, right? Not everyone wants that. So some form of sexual harassment. You have the physical, which involve the pinching, the patting, the touching, the kissing, or brushing against someone in a sexual manner. Right? You also have the verbal, which are unwelcome sexual suggestive jokes or insult based off a person's sex. And that is what we know in Jamaica as catcalling, right? I know some persons can give a very good example of catcalling. I remember just yesterday, I stepped out of the office and went on the road. I didn't decide to drive, so I was walking. And I had in one of my earphones and the other ear didn't have any. And a young man came right up to me and said something. Now I cannot repeat what he said, but let me try to see if I can bring it down. He was like, I would want to open your legs and do things to you. And I'm like, I didn't know what to do at the moment. So in my head, I stood there a little and I looked at him and I'm like, is that something that you would really want to say to a female? You don't know me. It's the first I'm seeing you. First you're seeing me. And that was your comment. right? So that is sexual harassment for me. That was my recent experience for sexual. It was very graphic. I can't repeat it here. And I'm sure other persons have received similar experience. And our statistics say, Mr. Scott stated some of the statistics, which are very real, right? But our statistics say 1 in every 3 Jamaican women experience sexual harassment at least once in their lifetime. 1 in every 3 Jamaican women. So it's very high in our culture. Another form of sexual harassment is nonverbal. So those are the sexually suggestive gestures, such as winks, stares, licking of lips, gestures with hands, fingers, and legs. So sometimes when you sit around a table and the person is rubbing their foot on your foot, they call it footsie, and it makes you uncomfortable, it is seen as sexual harassment. Another is the written, the visual, and the graphic. Now we're in a very, well, everything is mostly online now. Well, we're kind of moving to the regular culture, but for 2 years, 3 years, we have been doing a lot of online things, and we have to have numbers. So a lot of persons have our contacts, right? And some persons make the best of that, right? They send you emails, they'll send you letters, they'll call you, and sometimes they'll even display pornographic material, right? Just a picture they may see on the internet circulating, and they send it to you and ask you, what is your feedback? And you don't like that, it is seen as sexual harassment. Some persons don't think it is, but it is sexual harassment. Another is stalking or cyber stalking. We also have the peeping Tom, right? This person follows you everywhere you go, video, tape you, record you, take your photos, and you don't know that they're doing so. Seen as sexual harassment. Now, what is not considered sexual harassment? Even though we have this and we went through it, we are not robots, we're human beings, right? So you can have feelings for someone. We don't want anybody to think, oh, I'm no longer going to talk to this person. I'm no longer, if the person is okay with it, then it is fine. So what is not considered sexual harassment? Interaction between consenting adults, mutual attraction or flirtation, consensual relationship, expression of affection between friends. So if you like what is going on, it is okay. It is not sexual harassment. We have seen reports or cases of persons saying, okay, they were in a relationship and then they're out of the relationship, but one party is still, you know, complimenting or touching or having certain conversation. At that moment, it is considered sexual harassment, right? Once it makes you uncomfortable, even if you were involved, you no longer want that. And so it is seen as sexual harassment. The majority of victims are women, but men can also be victims. And why we say it like this, men generally don't like reporting this issue of sexual harassment because of our culture. And recently I had a friend that came to me and said, I am being harassed at my workplace. Now he took some pictures of the bruises on his hands and his side, and he explained what happened. So I told him to report it to his HR personnel. He said he would contemplate it. The next day he called me and said he's not going to report it, but he would want me to come into his organization and conduct one of my sessions. So I said, no man, go in details and tell me what really, really happened. So he told me what happened. A group of females basically ganged him at work and was grabbing him up and all that, touching, because he's a very handsome man, you know, those type of men that have muscles and stuff, right? So they decided to touch him up and they gang him. About 3 or 4 females did so to him. And so I said, so why you're not going to report it to your superiors? He said he told 2 of his co-workers, which are also males, he was explaining to them what happened. And they told him, brother, if you report it, you're soft. If you're glad the woman will grab you up. Not, right? Not every man get those type of things. So if you're lucky, that woman will grab you up. If you ever report it, I think you're soft. and you're gone the other way, right? Those were the remarks from his co-worker. Now, as a man, he's not going to want to report it. I'm still trying to convince him to do so, but he's not going to do so because of the stigma that is attached with it. But from these sessions, we hope that those ideologies will change from persons, and persons will then continue to make or start making reports, and those that are making reports continue to do so. So who are the frequent harassers? The majority of offenders are men, but there are cases of women sexually harassing men, as well as same-sex harassment. Who is at risk for sexual harassment? So girls and young women, domestic workers, migrant women, women in male-dominated job, and men in female-dominated job. So what to do if you're being harassed? So the first thing to do is to object immediately. Let the harasser know that they are harassing you. Because if you don't, they won't know. Some persons will tell you that I can't read body language, or as in our culture, they'll say, oh, I thought he or she was playing hard to get. Right? Keep your records. Write down what was said, what was done, the time, the date, the location. And if there's any witness, write it down. This is important. You may not want to report it immediately, but later on when you decide to report it, you can have your evidence to say this has been happening for X time, right? And according to the Act, you have up to 6 years to file a complaint. It is a civil matter, and civil court lasts 6 years. So you have up to 6 years to file a complaint. Speak to a trusted adult or a friend, a colleague that you trust, right? Find out if that person have harassed anyone before. Speak to your supervisor. If your supervisor is the one that's harassing you, you speak to someone in higher authority, right? If you go through all this process and you're still not comfortable, you're not getting through, you made a report, HR is not doing anything at all, the committee that is responsible for sexual harassment not doing anything at all, then you come to the Bureau of Gender Affairs. The Act states that you have up to 14 working days to commence an investigation. So once you make a report and you sign to it, 14 working days to start the investigation. So where can sexual harassment happen? At the workplace, in educational and training institution, medical facilities, public space, in accommodation, and in prison. The Act covers every institution here except for public space, right? We don't cover street harassment. We hope one day to get there, but we don't cover street harassment. So in filing a complaint for sexual harassment, any complaint concerning sexual harassment must be put in writing and sworn to by the relevant investigative body. So all this information must be included in that document: the full name and address of the complainant, full name and address of the respondent, a specification of the charge or charges, and a brief statement of the relevant and material facts. This is important. So let's get into the meat of the matter, the legislation. Right? Now, the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act 2021 is pretty short, not that long. These are the sections to it, and I will go into it now. So the Sexual Harassment Protection and Prevention Act 2021 was passed in July by the House of Representatives with 10 amendments following extensive debate on Friday, October 1st, 2021. The legislation was passed in the Senate with an additional 13 amendments. The Act received the Governor General's assent on November 2nd, 2021. So the Act is passed, however, it's not yet gazetted. Now, Part 1 speaks of the preliminary, so it gives definition of the terms that are in the Act. Terms such as sexual advance, sexual harassment, a worker, a complaint, a co-worker, and so on. Part 2 speaks of the prevention of sexual harassment, and it states here, an employer shall not sexually harass a worker shall not sexually harass a co-worker, a client, supervisor, or employer. A client shall not sexually harass a worker, and a prospective employer shall not sexually harass a person who is seeking employment. A person in the position of authority is prohibited from sexually harassing a student, resident, ward, inmate, patient, member, or anyone seeking admission, and a student, resident, ward, inmate, patient, or a member shall not sexually harass peers. So the act clearly gives parameters for these type of stuff. It clearly states what the role of the employee and an institution should do, ensure that the area is free from sexual harassment. We already went through the forms and the type of sexual harassment and prohibited conduct. Now let's talk about the Sexual Harassment Tribunal. The tribunal will have 14 members, some attorneys at law, some mediators, some justice of the peace. There will be selection from the minister responsible for culture, gender, entertainment, and sport, minister responsible for labor and social security, minister responsible for justice. Those ministers will come together and select some persons for the committee. Those persons will be members of trade union representative and so on. So the tribunal is created to hear and determine complaints of sexual harassment and make award. Upon receipt of a complaint, the tribunal may cause an investigation to be conducted into the particulars of the complaint by such person authorized by the tribunal as the tribunal deemed necessary and appropriate, having regard to the nature and circumstances of a complaint. So the tribunal speaks strongly against those that make false complaint, right? So if you falsely accuse someone of sexual harassment, you will receive a fine not exceeding $1 million or 3 months imprisonment. If you are guilty, actual guilty, exceeding $1 million or 3 months imprisonment. So pending the legislation, what is the response to address sexual harassment? Once the act is gazetted, it is mandatory that every institution creates a sexual harassment policy. All staff must be trained. There must be workshops. All staff must be trained. Ensure the issue of sexual harassment is incorporated in educational curricula. Create a grievance or a complaint or grievance procedure or committee to handle reports of sexual harassment from students and employees, and protect against victimization and false accusation. Let the accuser and the accuser equal chance to be what is being made. The person just take that and run with it. Do your investigation. Listen to both sides of the story before making a decision. So that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? Any comments?
In interest of time, and because our other presenter has to attend a meeting, what we'll do, we'll take the question and answer afterwards. So at this time, I will ask your attention to our second presenter, who I will now introduce. Our second presenter is none other than Rhona Morgan-Burchenson. She's an attorney at law, we won't hold that against her, and the head of legal and compliance for the Nestle Anglo-Dutch Caribbean Region. In her almost 12 years at the bar, she has practiced civil, criminal, human rights, and corporate law, and appeared in all of the courts in Jamaica and in Industrial Disputes Tribunal. As head of legal and compliance for over 23 islands, her core functions include shaping the strategy for the function, leveraging the digital to transform the unit, risk assessment and mitigation, and advocating on behalf of the company and key issues, and of course, supporting the regulatory function. She's a member of the board of directors and company secretary for Nestle Jamaica and Nestle Trinidad and Tobago Limited. We are blessed to have someone who is so well versed and so knowledgeable to address us today. So without further ado, let us warmly welcome our presenter, Rhona Morgan-Burchenson.
Thank you, Robert, for those kind words. Are you able to see my screen in full mode?
Yes, we are seeing you.
All right, excellent. All right, so I'll take you through. Jahmealla did an excellent job of summarizing what the legislation looks like. So my portion or my segment of the presentation is to walk you through the practical aspects of implementing or applying the Sexual Harassment Act. I was introduced, Rhona Morgan-Burchenson, Head of Legal and Compliance for Nestle Anglo-Dutch Caribbean. But what I want you to consider for the purpose of the presentation, and while I present, is what you currently have in place. Have a deeper look at what you currently have in place at your respective organizations. Is it something that can be developed or improved to be in line with the Sexual Harassment Act? Or do you have to create a new document entirely? And what you will see from the legislation is that a draft of the policy is annexed, so you don't have to recreate from scratch. That said, the focus today would just be a guide on how to implement the policy. We'll be looking at the employer's obligations. I won't spend too much time as Jahmealla covered that in detail. We'll also be looking at the policy must-haves that was also mentioned, but I'll give you a little insight into what we do at Nestle, and then give what I call the 4 C's, which is a step-by-step process of what a good sexual harassment framework should look like, and then a tidbit on the investigative steps and considerations when faced with a sexual harassment complaint. Now, under the legislation, there are 2 primary obligations of the employer. Jahmealla mentioned it. They're simply to just have a policy on sexual harassment and to sensitize staff as to that policy. And that's all good and well, but there are a few things that the policy that is being implemented must have. So when you're looking at what exists currently within your organization, and if you have to draft something from scratch, this is what the legislation says should be in place or embedded therein. The definition of sexual harassment must be there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's defined in the legislation. We can copy paste. There must be a statement that clarifies that the workplace or the environment within which we work should be free from harassment. That undertaking should be given. It should be clearly and explicitly stated. We should also have embedded that due process will be followed and that the accused may be subject to a disciplinary hearing. Let's not use the words that are absolute, such as will, because that provides a surety. So if you say that the accused may be subject to a hearing, it follows an investigative process that also details a possible outcome from that process. We should also have in our document how a complaint can be made internally. Jahmealla mentioned grievance procedures, speaking to HR, that should be clearly outlined as to the step that should be followed to make a formal complaint. And of course, to support Jahmealla's point, what should be supported or provided to HR when making that complaint. You have the statement, the name of the accused, the date of the alleged incident, etc. And it should also state how complaints can be resolved. The detailed steps should be outlined. Your policy should also mention explicitly that disciplinary measures may be taken in relation to sexual harassment. It goes a step further. We investigate, but the investigation may not always end up in a hearing. But if it does end up in a hearing, it will be a disciplinary hearing, and these are the guidelines that will be followed. Also should be stated that the entire procedure is confidential and will not be disclosed unless it is necessary for the investigation or for taking disciplinary action. If it ends up with disciplinary action, it may be shared with parties not previously connected to the investigation, or beyond the HR team, and that is where confidence is permitted to be breached under the legislation. There should also be a right of appeal that expressly stated on the adverse finding, and the worker can seek redress at the tribunal, the sexual harassment tribunal, but all internal processes must have been exhausted. So they should have gone through the grievance, gone through the hearing if it comes to that, lodged an appeal, and have not met with any favorable outcome. And it's on that premise that they can now take the matter before the tribunal. So there is a respect for the internal process. In a nutshell, this is what your policy should look like. Like I mentioned, we don't have to reinvent the wheel because there is a draft or proposed suggested policy annexed to the Sexual Harassment Act. Now, when you're looking at the steps in the process, my suggestion would be to enhance what you currently have if you have something in place already, or implement a document that includes these 4 C's. The first C is to codify, and I'll go a little bit into detail on the other slide. The second C is to communicate. The third C is to commit. And the fourth C I'm adding is to counsel. And these C's took into consideration the sexual harassment legislation as well as international best practices. We have to look a little deeper on what each C's mean. So in terms of codify, we're ensuring that the policy is documented. It's not just verbally stated, oh, we have a sexual harassment policy. And you know what? This is what it says. It must be written. And it must be in a place that is accessible to everyone. It must have the must-haves from the legislation. I mentioned that the policy can be standalone or it can be incorporated into an already existing document. I know at Nestle, we did not have a local sexual harassment policy. One is now being developed. However, we had a process in place, a whole section within our code of conduct that speaks to sexual harassment and how that will be handled or managed internally. So that's something that can be done as well. So it must be codified. We must have some codification, some written proof that this policy exists. And this is what the company is undertaking to be bound by. In addition to that, we must communicate. We have to ensure that our staff is fully aware of the policy and, importantly, the implications for breach. So I mentioned a step-by-step guide on the procedure, what would happen should a complaint be made. That must be clearly stated in your policy, and it must be communicated to persons to let them know that, hey, you know what, you sleep, this is gonna happen. This is likely to happen or will be the likely outcome should this allegation be made against you. And not only that, I would take it a step further in the communication by conducting sensitization workshops over a period of time. It may be annually, it may be biannually. You can circulate the document via email. For smaller organizations, you can have them sign that they've read and understood and place that on their file just to hold them accountable. But it must be communicated. I know for an organization like Nestle, it is a large organization, so we do have what we call iLearns, which is an e-learning platform that it's a course that's online every employee has to take. And it's so seriously held that the mandate directly comes from our head office in Switzerland. So for the larger companies, that's something you can explore, having that type of system in place to communicate to your staff. But for the smaller organizations, you can utilize some of the tips that I've provided here. And it doesn't have to be formal. It could just be a meeting or the policy circulated. It can be a one-pager with a link to the policy. It doesn't have to be anything on a grander scale. The third C is to commit. And in committing is the company's commitment to ensuring that the message is clear, that there is a zero tolerance when it comes on to sexual harassment in the workplace. And this is despite who may be accused. So it doesn't matter if you're a manager, it doesn't matter if you're the CEO, it doesn't matter if you're an ancillary staff member. The policy applies and the company is committing to this zero tolerance. And additionally, it doesn't matter who the perpetrator is or alleged victim or perpetrator is. It doesn't matter if you're a woman alleged of harassing another woman or another man. So it's not gender biased. And that should be made clear as well. A great example of what exists in our society was mentioned in the earlier presentation about the young man in the organization and it being viewed a particular way. So having that firm commitment from the company is a steer in the right direction. And then finally, and I add this, it's something that I don't see in many places, but it's something that we do at Nestle, is offer counsel. And we don't do it internally, but what international best practice dictates is that we must create an environment, and in fact, the sexual harassment policy dictates that as well. We must create an environment that is free from harassment. And to create that environment, we have to have embedded within our culture that we care about the mindset and the emotional well-being of our employees. Now at Nestle, we have an employee assistance program that we use if we do have staff members are in need of independent confidential counseling, and the program is there to support affected employees. But for some companies who do not have the resources to do that, I have great examples in other companies within Jamaica. They have utilized the services of a local church, a local pastor, to provide that service for their staff. And for the women that I know in those companies that have been impacted, they found this particularly useful. And this can be across the board, eh? It doesn't have to just be for persons who are victims of sexual harassment. Now, in looking at the process, the report is made. The report can be against an employee, a fellow employee, could be a supervisor, it doesn't matter, or someone who is a peer within the organization, or it could be made against a client. What happens once the report is made? The investigation has to be launched by the company. And then from that, you have two possible outcomes. Could be a charge against the individual accused or no charge. If it's no charge, the matter ends there. If there is a charge, it usually is followed by a hearing, then the appeal, and then possibly the tribunal. In any event, whatever the outcome, the act dictates that secure confidential log of the complaint must be made. So in essence, this is what your process will look like. Now, remember when going through the process, and this is very important because I don't want us to look at this in isolation, we have to consider not only the Sexual Harassment Act, but also our Labor Relations Code, what that prescribes in terms of due process, and the labor legislation generally. And the process must be clear, and the parties must be treated fairly across the board. And that's it. That's the extent of the presentation.
Thank you so much, and can I have a round of applause for both presenters who did extremely well in such a short period of time, sharing good information. We now have the Q&A, and we know Rhona will have to leave very soon, and perhaps I will prime the pump. You mentioned counseling as very important, and I can think of an incident in my workplace where we actually sent the perpetrator for counseling. What are your views and what are your thoughts about that?
I'm open to that. I'm open to rehabilitation of any form, or helping someone to work through a particular issue. And maybe it's just me to understand the perspective or the incident from another person's perspective. So the counseling that I suggested is not just for the alleged accused or the accused, if the case was made out, but it's also for the victim as well, for them to, depending on the nature of the harassment, for them to regroup, to understand what occurred. It can be a frightening experience being sexually harassed. So the counseling would be for both parties. So I'm very open to that.
Thank you so much. So can we have the first question from the audience?
Robert, if I may interject before the first question comes, unfortunately it's 11 and I have to jump off. But if there are any questions for me, feel free to leave my email and I'll be more than happy to answer them. And yes, the presentation will be shared.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rhona. Excellent job.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
So, Jahmealla, you will now have to answer all the questions.
Oh, sure, no problem. That's fine.
Can we have the first one? Or do I need to prime the pump further? Allow me. So what we saw in the last presentation was a process and the investigation. But it's not only important the fact that you do the presentation, but what is also important is how it's done. And there's a term called re-victimization. And that if you are not careful in this whole investigation, the victim can actually be drawn through the ordeal once again. So it's very important that it's done with a certain level of humanity and humility. I see a question. Do we have a question?
I see a raised hand.
From the JMEA, no less. Please proceed.
Good morning. This is Andrea Johnson from the JMEA. My question is actually for Ms. Romance. In your presentation, you spoke about 14 days, up to 14 days after the incident or the infraction to make a report. I don't know if I misunderstood, so my question is for clarity. Is it that it has to be done within 14 days? Suppose the person doesn't get the courage to do it within that 14 days and 14 days passes, what happens?
No, man. Whenever you get the courage and you file a complaint, this is when you go to the committee or the person responsible. So when you file a complaint, you go to your HR, you sit down and you say, this is what happened, XYZ, XYZ, and you put it in writing and it is signed. So today is the 13th and you sign today. The investigation should commence within 14 working days.
Okay, so it's the investigation.
Right.
Okay, all right.
It should start, not all complete, right? Should start.
Okay.
Right.
All right, thank you.
You're most welcome.
Thank you for that response. And I perhaps just restate what you said, Jahmealla, that you can report an offense up to 6 years.
6 years, right.
Speaks to that?
Yes, it's there because it's a civil matter. Sexual harassment is a civil matter, not a criminal matter.
I understand. So do we have any other questions from the audience? Do raise your hands, or you can feel free to write them in the chat if you so do. We do have a few minutes left, of course.
It's good to see that board presentation. We're very clear. Wow.
Would you really like to throw in a little bonus, Jahmealla, just since we are all here and the questions aren't really forthcoming?
I don't know what else to share, right? I know sometimes for my presentation, I would share a little video just to sum up everything and how it looks in our workplace setting. But apart from that, I don't know what else anybody wants me to go in.
Well, let me throw a question again, priming the pump. So we got information as to how to put a policy in our organization. What are some of the tips or hints that you could give us in putting that policy? Because what we're having here, we're putting in a structure, whereas our culture is 180 degrees different from what that culture speaks about. We talk about the inform of the dead, you're soft if you make them reports, all these kind of things. What are some of the tips to help to ingrain this new thinking in our organizations?
Well, we normally give, Rhona basically went through it. That is those were my exact tips that I normally give to persons, right? When creating their policy. We also have our checklists that we have at the Bureau of Gender Affairs. It's a not a long checklist, right? But we have it, we could email it to you, right? So you can create your policy. As I said before, it's similar to the other presenter, exact same way, right? So I wouldn't add or take away from that presentation.
Got you, I got you. I'm seeing something here in the chat, and this is from Grace. What if an employee no longer works for the company? How do they go about reporting an incident that took place while they were employed to that company, and who do they report it to? Fantastic question.
Well, in a case like that, you are no longer employed to the institution, so you can then come to the Bureau of Gender Affairs and make a report to the Sexual Harassment Tribunal for.
And I suspect that if
matter, and they'll do the investigation. No, in a case like that, no man, come on, continue.
Okay. So if the victim no longer works there, but suppose the perpetrator no longer works there, the Bureau would actually try to find where that person is now employed, or where that person is.
That is a tedious one, right? To try to find that person, that can be very, very tedious. But I don't know, I've never received a case like that.
Okay. So I'm going back to the chat and I'm asking
somebody,
question.
But it would be hard to find. No, I say it would be hard to find, but if you do find the person, then I don't know, I wouldn't want to say that I'm gonna mash up them new work life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But you can give a warning to them if you do find them.
Okay. So what is the direction? This is a question from another member of the panel, of the event, participants. What is the direction to take if a complaint is made but not made? I.e., the person said it to you, but they don't want it to be an official complaint, maybe reporting to a supervisor or a trusted friend within the organization. How should a matter like that be treated?
You cannot, nothing will be done there. If you don't officially do something, you have to officially do it. You have to, right? You have to make a report. You can't talk to a friend and say, no, so this person is harassing me. And I don't know, you expect that friend to, your friend can make a report for you. Your coworker can make a report. So if the coworker said to you, do you want me to make an official report to allow the community to handle the matter? Then that can be done, but we don't want to go on speculation. So it has to be done in the formal way.
Thank you for that direction, and thank you for that very good question. I have another question here. For small organizations who would not necessarily have a designated HR, what would be the best course of action to report a matter? In other words, who do you report it to?
Yes, so for informal institutions at the corner shop, bars, so forth, they can come straight to the Bureau of Gender Affairs and make their reports, and we will handle the matter.
Okay, so we move to another question. Is there a provision in the law for the investigation to arrive at a conclusion within a maximum time limit, either way? In other words, will it drag through the courts? Is there a sort of finite time within which things has to be investigated?
There isn't. So once investigation has come, right, and in quick time, right? So we don't hope it takes a year or 6 months, like some matter, but we want it to be as short as possible.
Okay. We now have a question from Kamisha, which is $1 million question if you ask me. And this question is, at what point does the organization become liable, open or susceptible to a lawsuit?
Right, I mentioned it in my presentation. I'm not sure if you recall when I said if a report is being made and nothing is being done after the 14 days, or the process is being drawn out even after the investigation has commenced, then the institution will be held liable for that. And it would be the tribunal will make that decision, As I can't speak to say what will they be held liable for, will there be a fine, will there be jail time, but I know they'll be held liable for that. The law states that.
So business owners, business leaders, the writing's on the wall. These things can't be swept under the carpet anymore. It has to be dealt with, otherwise you will pay. Excellent. Excellent question, excellent response.
I have a follow-up to it, Robert, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead.
So Ms. Romance, what if the perpetrator is a repeated offender where the organization, say for example, it's a family business or so, and they would have gotten complaints before and they have not properly addressed it, and they have this person just keep working there or in the organization, does that make them susceptible to a lawsuit as well?
I wouldn't say a lawsuit for that. That would be upon the tribunal, right? That would be upon the tribunal. But if a case like that, then I know there will be some action for the institution or the owners for the institution, because you should take proper action to ensure that it does not happen again.
So companies need to be aware of this as they prepare their overall risk management strategy, that things like this can get them into hot water with the law. Do we have any more questions? I asked for the first time. And second time, I see a question here. Thank you, Bradley. Suppose the feeling is that an investigative process is being hampered from reaching a free and fair conclusion. What safeguards are in place so that the matter is dealt with fairly?
Okay, sorry, geez. I don't know what's happening. Right, so with that, then if you go through your process in terms of your institution and you feel like it's hampered, then when you come to the Bureau of Gender Affairs, we will do another investigation to ensure that there is a free or fair and free process.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we have run out of questions at this point. So I'll ask for the second time. Do we have any questions?
Right, simple as that. Approve the fair.
And I ask for the third time. Do we have any other questions? So what I'll then do at this point in time, I promised you a bonus. And not for a moment am I thinking that you're still here because of the bonus. But there is a report from Transparency International on the topic of sextortion. And I think it's very useful that as we started to educate ourselves as to what happens, that we learn what happens across the world and perhaps what are some of the strategies that can be employed. This is certainly on a macro level, but I think it is useful. And I invite everyone to avail themselves. I have just put it in the chat, so feel free to download it. Everyone should have easy access to click into it and getting the report. So I entrust that for your further education on the topic. And I therefore now deliver the vote of thanks on behalf of the JMEA. Let me thank you so much for turning up. We have 28 persons in total. I must thank our presenters, Jahmealla, and of course Rhona, who really took time out of a busy day to come and share with us something that is certainly dear to them and certainly critical to us as business leaders, business owners, managers, and leaders within our organization. So we thank them very much. We thank you, King John, for coming and giving those very, very important words that you did and for staying on for the entire time. This is one thing that characterizes your leadership. is that you lead from in front, and you're here with us getting this very good information. So thank you for being here, and thank you for continuing to be a good example. And what would a workshop be without workshop participants? So I thank each and every one of you who has stayed the course, who have asked the questions, and come to prepare yourself, because we talk about being a first world country. But being a first world doesn't just speak about matters such as income and so on, but it means that we change the processes, we change the way we think, and the very macho way that we approach society, the very cavalier attitude we have towards sex, and also where we look on other, particularly women in our society, as chattel and objects of our pleasure, has to stop. And it is things like this, legislation like this, and like this, where we speak about the problem and we leave and put things in our organization which will make that difference. So I thank you all very much, and do have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.